चलो
We'll transition now to Leah.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you to everyone on the Zoom who joined online. My name is Ria, and today I'll be discussing the associations between perceived discrimination, incident hypertension, and social support using data from the multi-ethnic study of atherosclerosis. This is the brief overview of what I'll be covering today. So beginning with some background, hypertension, also known as high blood pressure, impacts nearly half of the American population. It's considered the major risk factor for the leading cause of death in this country, cardiovascular disease, due to the constriction it causes in the arteries, as you can see here. Literature has shown there exists a significant association between perceived discrimination and hypertension. Many investigators attribute this to the social stress theory, where higher levels of discrimination trigger the biological stress response in the body, which leads to negative physical and mental health outcomes and worsens the maintenance and prevention of hypertension. So to combat these harmful effects of discrimination, social support has been shown to modify the psychological and physical stressors that are associated with discrimination by providing a large network of support that individuals can lean on when faced with acts of discrimination. Despite knowledge that various social factors can influence the risk of developing hypertension, the current literature on the modifying effects of social support really focus mainly on mental health outcomes as opposed to cardiovascular health outcomes. So there really lacks an understanding of how social support could modify the relationship between perceived discrimination and hypertension. So with that in mind, this study aimed to answer the following question: how does the impact of perception of discrimination on incident hypertension vary across levels of social support? And with the prior literature, we hypothesized that experiencing discrimination is positively associated with incident hypertension, and this relationship is attenuated with increasing levels of social support. So going into the methods, as I mentioned, we used data from the multi-ethnic study of atherosclerosis, which was a prospective cohort which recruited nearly 7,000 participants aged 45 to 84, sampled from 6 study sites nationwide. The study also conducted 6 exams, which spanned over the course of about 2 years, from 2000 to 2018, to collect various biomarkers and data with the goal of assessing risk factors for subclinical atherosclerosis. And then to analyze our exposure of perceived discrimination, we looked at both everyday discrimination and lifetime discrimination. So to measure everyday discrimination, we used the Everyday Discrimination Scale, which basically asked participants how often they had experienced discriminatory actions across 9 domains. Each of these 9 items was then reverse coded, summed, and then averaged to obtain a mean score that was then categorized into these approximate quartiles. To measure lifetime discrimination, we used the Major Experiences of Discrimination Scale, which asked participants if they had ever experienced discrimination over the course of their lifetime across 6 domains. Responses were then summed and by summing the affirmative responses, and then that score was then categorized into these 3 groups. For our outcome of incident hypertension, the study defined hypertension as being any blood pressure reading at or above 140/90. And to assess our time to event, because we were looking at incident hypertension, we defined that as the midpoint between the last non-hypertensive exam and the first hypertensive exam. For our effect measure modifier of social support, we used the Enrich scale, which asked participants how often they felt they had the availability of social support across 6 domains. Their responses were then summed and then categorized into these 3 groups. And finally, we adjusted for these covariates based on prior literature indicating the importance of adjusting for these basic sociodemographic characteristics when looking at the relationship between discrimination and hypertension. To obtain our final analytical sample, we began with our total at-risk population, where we had removed participants who already had hypertension at baseline. We then removed participants who were missing discrimination, social support, or any of the covariates to obtain our final analytical sample of 3,394 participants. And finally, for our statistical analysis, we conducted Cox proportional hazards models, where we adjusted for the previously mentioned covariates. We also analytically assessed the proportional hazards assumption and found that age violated this assumption, so we incorporated a time interaction adjustment in our models. We conducted 2 models, one where the exposure was everyday discrimination, one where the exposure was lifetime discrimination, and also assessed for the interaction of social support. So with those statistical analyses, we obtained the following results. Beginning with our baseline characteristics where we stratified by outcome. This is just a brief overview of the population distribution, but there are some key aspects that I wanted to highlight. As you can see here, over the course of the study period, 29.3% developed hypertension, and the average age at baseline was 59.2. You can see here that the cohort was ethnically diverse as well. And interestingly, individuals who were Black and did not have a college degree were overrepresented in the hypertension subpopulation as compared to the total population. When stratifying these results by the exposure variables of everyday discrimination and lifetime discrimination, we found that 23.1% reported experiencing high everyday discrimination and 20.6% reported experiencing lifetime discrimination in 2 or more domains. This table also shows that individuals who are younger and Black were more likely to experience high everyday discrimination, as well as more likely to experience lifetime discrimination in 2 or more domains. When assessing for the interaction of social support, we did not find significant results. As you can see that these estimates all continue to null. And when looking at our multivariate models, we found that everyday discrimination did not have a significant impact on incident hypertension, as we can see here that all estimates contain the null. However, lifetime discrimination did have a significant impact on the development of hypertension. As you can see here, individuals who experienced lifetime discrimination in one domain had 1.16 times the hazard of developing hypertension compared to individuals who did not experience lifetime discrimination. And individuals who experienced lifetime discrimination in 2 or more domains had 1.15 times the hazard of developing hypertension as compared to individuals who did not experience any lifetime discrimination. So with that in mind, you can see that contrary to our hypothesis, the association between discrimination and hypertension did not significantly vary across levels of social support. This may be because of the measurement that we used in this study measured more of the availability of social support, but did not quite capture the degree of use or accessibility of social support. So future studies could instead look at different social support measurement scales that may better assess its modifying effects against discrimination. But in line with our hypothesis, we found clear support that perceived discrimination significantly impacts incident hypertension. It is important, however, to distinguish between everyday discrimination and lifetime discrimination, because we saw that everyday discrimination was significant while lifetime discrimination was not significant while lifetime discrimination was. And this may be because lifetime discrimination has more of a reflects more of the systemic sources of discrimination across the course of a lifetime, whereas everyday discrimination emphasizes more of the minor interactions on a daily basis. So given the study's significant result with lifetime discrimination, but not everyday discrimination, perhaps the more systemic nature of discrimination as opposed to the daily exposure majorly impacts cardiovascular disease risk factors like hypertension. It's also important to note these results within the context of its strengths and limitations. So we can see here, to start out with temporality, we were able to establish a temporal relationship between discrimination and hypertension by taking advantage of the 6 exams carried out over the course of nearly 2 decades. As just previously mentioned, we were able to distinguish between everyday and lifetime discrimination to get a better sense of what participants were reporting experiencing. And as Table 1 showed, we have an ethnically diverse cohort, which makes these results a bit more generalizable to the diverse American population. And finally, we use social support as an effect measure modifier, which is one of the few to use it in such a way between discrimination and hypertension. However, there are some limitations that are important to note. This was an older cohort with an average age at baseline of 59.2. So future studies could consider expanding to younger cohorts and see if the relationships found in this study may hold true at earlier aspects of the life course, where individuals, particularly those of more marginalized communities, may be at a higher risk of developing hypertension at an earlier age. Additionally, this study defined hypertension as being at or above 140/90, but recently the American Heart Association revised this definition to actually be 130/80. So with this new definition, we excluded some participants who may have actually been experiencing hypertension, and future studies should use this revised definition. And finally, there's definitely room for perception bias, which is the discrepancy between levels of discrimination actually experienced and what is self-reported due to potential psychosocial differences in how to process these events. So, for example, someone who reported experiencing discrimination to a higher degree may actually be at a lower risk of developing hypertension than as compared to someone who experienced discrimination to a lesser degree. So with all that in mind, overall, this study found that social support did not have significant modifying effects when looking at the relationship between discrimination and hypertension. And the hope is that future studies could further investigate social support, perhaps looking at different social support measurement scales or looking at different coping mechanisms to better understand its buffering effects against discrimination, and particularly in relation to cardiovascular disease risk factors. We did find clear support that perceived discrimination, particularly lifetime discrimination, significantly impacts incident hypertension. And ultimately, the goal of this study and the hope for the goal of future studies is to really understand and eliminate hypertension disparities by focusing on social factors like discrimination or social support. Here are my references. And then I just wanted to thank Mahasan, thank you so much for being my faculty advisor and guiding me through this whole process. Eleni, thank you so much. You might be on Zoom, but I want to thank Eleni for helping me with the moment I got my hands on the data set. She walked me through every step of the way, and Singh for helping me with all the statistical analysis, and R also to the MESA study for letting me use the data, and of course the Postdoc cohort for making this year so memorable. So thank you all.
Thank you, Ria. Also amazing and really interesting study. Okay, maybe I start with this. Can you explain a little bit about the statistical analysis you did and the Cox, I think,
yes,
hazard? And I'm specifically interested in sort of what that analysis is, and also what the hazard means.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so basically the Cox model looks at, the importance is about looking at time to event. So it incorporates how time can interact with this relationship. And so that's why it was important to see at which point hypertension was developed. And so the hazard basically is a relative measure. So that's how I was able to compare with people who experienced lifetime discrimination in 2 or more domains compared to those who didn't, and what the hazard is of developing hypertension over the course of the period. So it's really helpful in establishing that temporal relationship, as I mentioned, was a strength of this study, to be able to understand relative to people who may not have experienced the exposure, how likely they are to develop the outcome. So in this case, incident hypertension. And then this is just more follow-up information on more specifically on the analytical assessment I did, that Cox models, they are based off of the assumption that hazard ratios are constant over time. And so when I checked for if this was, I first conducted like a global likelihood ratio test to basically see if any of the covariates might violate this assumption and actually change over time and not be constant. And because I found using the 0.05 threshold that this was significant, I knew that 1 or more of the covariates might actually be violating this assumption. And then when I did that, I did find that age was significant in both exposures of lifetime and everyday discrimination. So I included a time interaction adjustment for that to accommodate for the fact that age was changing over time, to be able to better assess the hazard ratios that were developed.
So is hazard kind of like, do you think that with this model, or just in your conceptualization of the study, like, are you suggesting that there's a direct causality or like some other level of correlation?
Yeah, I think with this kind of study, it's hard to determine causality because we weren't able to do like a randomized controlled trial where we were able to have people experience discrimination, comparing that to people who did not experience any discrimination at all. It's definitely also a somewhat limitation of this study, as mentioned, with the perception bias, that it's reliant on a lot of self-reported measures of discrimination. So what does that really mean? And so it's definitely difficult to determine some sort of causality, but because of the significance of results we were able to find, we can definitely see a sort of trend in how discrimination can impact hypertension. And this is also really in line with a lot of the literature too, as mentioned in the brief background as well. So I would hesitate to say causality, but I think these findings do show promise for maybe more of a strong relationship between discrimination and hypertension.
And then the perception bias thing is interesting. I was wondering if you could go back to that slide.
Yes.
How many people reported it having experienced discrimination? And sort of wondering if you or were you thinking of, or go back some more.
Which
the table. Go back. Maybe this one.
them reporting.
Yeah, I was wondering if you considered, or if you had disaggregated, maybe I missed it, but disaggregated by race and the perception of bias, because it's sort of interesting. Like if you look at the, if you keep going, it looked like.
Did you want to see the tables?
Yeah.
This one?
Yeah, it was kind of interesting, like what percentage of folks felt that they've had everyday or lifetime discrimination.
Right. Like you're looking at kind of across races here versus everyday versus lifetime.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is that, and that's exactly why I wanted to note that it does seem like compared across the board, it seems like Black individuals were more likely to experience higher everyday discrimination as well as lifetime discrimination in two or more domains, and other races maybe did not have as significant of a trend. The literature review that we conducted did definitely show the role of race as potentially being a factor in this discrimination variable and how it was experienced. So we did want to do a racial, like stratified by race as well, but that would have really underpowered the study because then we would have been doing like a three-way interaction with social support as well. So so we didn't have the power for that, but future studies, I actually, would mention that as a next step would definitely be to incorporate race, because there definitely does seem to be a trend and literature supports that as well. So I think future studies should definitely look at doing more of a race stratified model and seeing how the discrimination varies across races.
That makes sense. I can see that. And then I guess I'll end with sort of a similar question of like, so what? How would you, like, what would you tell clinicians dealing with hypertension or social scientists or public health experts based on the study? Like, what do you suggest? How do you interpret it for them?
Right. Yeah. So I think this is a really exciting finding because with cardiovascular disease being the leading cause of death and with hypertension being that major risk factor, it seems like it would be beneficial to, especially with a public health lens, to be able to kind of combat or modify that in ways that aren't really related to maybe medications or don't wait for hypertension to get so much worse that it instead focuses on later downstream interventions. So I think it's worth noting how discrimination is really impacting the effect of hypertension. So if we're talking about, like you mentioned, clinicians, maybe like an intake question could be sources of discrimination, maybe like explicitly asking that and seeing if they can reflect on that on their own and seeing what can be used to combat it. And I did mention that there are other coping mechanisms against discrimination. So it could be interesting to look at other forms of social support or other coping mechanisms to help combat that relationship. But ultimately, I think it's just really powerful to see more social factors that are influencing hypertension when previously it's kind of only been a knowledge of maybe genetics or maybe more biological factors that may influence your risk for developing hypertension or it developing into cardiovascular disease. So I think the fact that we can look at more social factors to hopefully be having more upstream intervention and solution can be really helpful to hopefully reduce the number of cases we see of cardiovascular disease every year.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi Ria, really great job. I love reading your paper. That was very interesting. I actually talked about it in my discussion sections today because we were talking about like the effects of like multiple exposures and we were talking about the social support network. So I'm like, oh, I have a paper for you. So really great job. Thank you. First, I'm a little curious, like I don't know if you know this about the specific MESA cohort, but I was wondering, because you said that one of the strengths of your study was the ethnic diversity, but also in the paper, you also list that as a limitation because you only have data on one nationality of Asian individuals,
Yeah.
Chinese individuals. So I was just wondering if like you knew why that was, or the study is looking to expand to other nationalities of Asian individuals and other races, like
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So when the MESA cohort started, it was in 2000. So at that point, I think this was like one of the first studies to really have focus on more races when looking at cardiovascular health. So in that regard, it was kind of a pioneer in having even inclusion of other races, like the Chinese population. I think it was very early on to be incorporating with that. But I think now that in these past 2 decades, where there's been so much more of an increase in diversity, and that there's been just a huge influx of individuals from different countries, that now it seems like there should be more of a focus on, as you said, kind of disaggregating some of these races, and also I mentioned in the paper that including more cardiovascular disease vulnerable populations like South Asian populations and Native Americans. So it seems like it might be something that we could definitely expand to in future studies to really hone in on more races, because as Dr. Hart was mentioning in that question as well, like being able to look at how different races may experience discrimination, and also just having different vulnerabilities to cardiovascular disease.
Also, I wanted to turn to your table 3, because it showed that those who experienced lifetime discrimination in one domain had like I think like 1.16 hazard of those, like compared to those who had discrimination in 2 or more domains. So I was wondering if you had any like hypotheses as to like why these numbers are so similar, because like I would have thought that like the more domains of your experiencing discrimination, the higher the hazard of hypertension would be. But I wonder if you want to just like
I think for that I'll actually go into more of the categorization of lifetime discrimination. So we consider that there was a very small numbers that were looking at anything above 2 for any sort of discrimination of experiencing lifetime discrimination. So it was kind of difficult to categorize it in a way where we could actually find like concrete differences, because so few people really reported lifetime discrimination. We categorized it in this way just because we felt like this was the best way to distinguish between, we kind of categorize it. And also this paper, which also used the MESA cohort for its study, used similar categorization. So I think the fact that there isn't that many more people who really experience everyday or lifetime discrimination after might be a reason for the similarities.
Awesome, thank you. And then, did you look into also if like somebody experienced like lifetime discrimination and everyday discrimination, like if individuals in your study like experience both of these things, or individuals more sensitive to the same one together?
That's a great question. I think that would be a really great way to do for future studies, to be able to see the compounding effect, especially since weathering is such a common concept of, if the more discrimination you experience, kind of maybe the worse health outcomes you develop. But this study did focus mainly on, as I mentioned, with the 2 models, on having one model focus just on the exposure of everyday and one with just the exposure of lifetime. But I think that would be a really interesting next step to see how the compounding works and changes results.
And then also something in your discussion section you mentioned was that if you were to like review the study, you would have liked to expand into like the cohort of like more larger age range. I was wondering if you were able to like look at any literature that like had a more age diverse cohort, or like what you think the effect of including younger people in your study might have on like the analytics model.
Sorry, to look at if they're younger, look at studies with younger cohorts.
Yes.
So the reason why I brought that up as a potential limitation is because actually the American Heart Association had come out with saying that there should be more of a focus on looking at more adolescents and young adults, because they have been shown in that kind of time period to be experiencing a lot of discrimination that's not really focused on in the current literature. So I haven't seen a lot of the current literature on focusing on the younger cohort, but because of that American Heart Association publication, it seems like there should be more of a focus on looking at if they do develop discrimination at that earlier age, perhaps they are more, especially for, as I mentioned, individuals of more marginalized communities, maybe it is that they are at a higher risk of developing hypertension. So I kind of, based on that off of that American Heart Association publication.
Yeah, I was just also wondering, what other, because I know you discussed like possibly using a different scale to analysis like social support networks. And I was wondering like what other coping mechanisms do you think would be helpful to be measured for future studies? Like what sort of measures do you think should be included to make that more robust?
Yeah, I think for that, I was looking at the multi-dimensional. So this is what I mentioned that could be helpful to also look at, because this assesses the use and availability. So instead of being from this, the answers to these questions are very strongly disagree to very strongly agree. So instead of focusing on the frequency of availability, this focuses on the actual specific ways that they could access. So it focuses a little bit more on the accessibility of social support. So maybe that could be a better way to capture its buffering effects. But there's also literature showing more of the problem focused or emotional focused coping mechanisms that people have developed to kind of combat when faced with active discrimination. So I would suggest that future studies can either use this kind of scale or look at more of the problem focus or emotional focus to see if that can help.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yay, Ria! Awesome job. Great job, Ria.